We're live. Welcome back, everybody. This is our fourth podcast in the Hello World series. We're coming up on our fifth week of the teaching this weekend. I'm here with Pastor Larry and Pastor Brett, and we're going to be talking through the story of the Tower of Babel. Some call it Babel. Others call it Babel. I don't know which one it is, but I'm going to go with Babel.
Well, let's spell it. B-A-B-E-L, which rhymes with label, not label. Label, and Babel has two B's, so in the Hebrew it's a long A, and it should be Babel, but because we babble on, we just kind of call it Babel a lot, but It's really Babel.
It is what it is.
Does that have something to do with Babylon? You had to do it, didn't
No, you had to get it started already.
Does it have something to do with Babylon?
No, I don't know.
The city of Babel.
They think that actually that where this was in the plain of Shinar was really in Babylon. So I really hadn't thought about that connection. But
So do we call it Babylon?
Well, if you spell it, you can. Just
I don't know anybody.
If you're going to spell it
Babel.
B-A-B-B-L-E, we'll call it Babel. If it's B-A-B-E-L, just like label, then it should be pronounced Babel.
Okay.
The Hebrew word is
Babel.
Confused or
The Hebrew word is Babel.
yeah, the way it sounds.
That's right. B long A
Phonetically.
B-E-L. Yeah, it's not really. It's really not a debate. I mean, obviously it is a debatable point, but
debatable point.
Yeah, it's a debatable point.
Should we start
You
over?
say debatable, I say.
Okay. Moving on from that, we're in the story of the Tower of Babel, and this is the last of the primordial stories. You said primeval stories, and what is the significance of this story?
Well, I mean, I think the story follows the flood, so I think that you have to put it within context. I think all these stories flow together, so to just pull one out and say it stand alone is really not an appropriate thing to do. So the world has just been flooded. There's a do-over. Everybody's out, and there's this whole lineage of what happens after Noah, the kids, and all this stuff, and it comes down to this time. And it seems like, and I'll tell the story briefly, they decide to construct this tower reaching up to the heavens. And they said, surely if we do this, then we can be so unified. No one can stand against us, and we will not be scattered around the face of the earth. And that was their hope. And they built this tower, and it was not out of stones, but it was out of brick, and they baked the brick so they'd be harder and used mortar that was a little more flexible. They had the building scheme down. It's interesting because if you go back in history and you look at some of these ancient buildings, they built some amazing buildings that we still cannot replicate. I mean, I've been to the pyramids and the temples in Luxor, and they say no engineering today can get these as straight as what these are. And it's fantastic to look at. So what they were building was probably something phenomenal. But why would they build it high? My first, they build it high. We're going to get there so we can speak one language, kind of like we won't need God.
Yeah.
And then God comes down and says, hey, what are you guys doing? Surely if they all speak the same language and they will try to replicate me, this is not what I want in society. So I'm going to confuse their languages. And once they couldn't talk to each other, they couldn't say, hey, hand me the hammer. And it seems like things got really distorted and it all fell apart. And the ultimate end was they were scattered among the face of the earth. What they didn't want to happen ultimately happened. So that's kind of the story in itself.
Right.
And but the meaning there, has lots of possibilities,
What do you think, Brett? What does it mean? You wrote notes this week.
I did.
And emailed them to me. And I even looked at them.
You did?
I don't remember what they said, but I looked at them.
Nice.
So that's good. What do you think, Brett?
Well, I think the story, like you said, is primarily pointing out that things can get problematic. Chaos can ensue if you think that the best way forward is to leave the highest and best out, to leave God out of the picture. And so there's an emphasis on language again, because that's such a powerful thing that human beings, something that sets human beings apart. And so they're looking for unity, but they want to be God themselves. So they're building the tower up to the heavens where the gods are.
Now, one of the things I thought about this week, which I really haven't heard much comment on, was if you follow the flood story. Now, if it were flooding and this room were to flood, we would take all the important equipment, we'd put it up higher. And if it got up higher, we would all seek higher ground. But it is interesting that right after the flood, these guys are building a tower that may be a rescue tower. We don't need an ark. we're going to be okay.
We can do it our way.
We'll build our own salvation mechanism. So that if God decides to play a game on us like he did Noah and the rest of the world, we can get beyond that. We can do it without him. So I think that emphasis at least has to be considered as a possibility.
Oh, I think, yeah. I'd never thought about that, but
I know.
That makes sense.
It's original.
You just don't think.
Who was it that told you that? You need to give him credit.
Larry Bockham.
Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
No,
I thought you said
I hadn't
somebody.
either.
I thought you said somebody told you.
No.
Oh,
no.
you just.
I just thought about it this week. I'd never heard of it before, and it may not stand up under a lot of scrutiny, but
That's
hey,
a schizophrenia.
Yeah, it may not. Yeah.
Either way,
if
I
it's
like it.
terrible,
It was good.
I'll do a disclaimer and say it's Brett's idea. Yeah. No, it's fine. But I think that is something to consider within the context of looking at the flood and the follow-up, that higher ground is an important thing. And I also think that when you look at this story and you want to pull it apart and try to take a meaning out of it, if you really want to analyze it, well, why would God be so insecure that he'd come down and destroy? He's looking for unity. He wants them to be like him and confuse their languages. Why would this malevolent God go and do that? To say that really is to miss the point of the story again. But that's what we like to do. We like to get all these the little things. I just think it'd be great here at Suncoast. I'll just go with it this minute. I think we should build the Tower of Babel here and charge $50 a head and go up and say, hey, you can see the Ark in Kentucky if we build it
But
high
you can
enough.
see the tower here. You can
That's
see
right.
it from here.
That's right.
Jesus.
That's legitimate.
That's what it's all about, right there.
Yeah, we'll one up them.
Well, this has been fun. I'm gonna have to cut us out now.
Wait a second. I got some more to say.
So with that whole tower thing, I like that though. The getting up above where the floods could get you. The last week you talked about how disaster is coming. Bad things will happen, and the way that you get around those, or you get through those, not around them but through them, is by walking with God,
right.
by aiming higher. And then it's kind of the next story is, well, let's aim super high then. Let's aim the highest that we can go. And somehow they try to take God out of the equation in that. So what does that all mean then?
I think you could you're making a great point. But I think instead of aiming higher, they were just saying, we're going to construct that which will keep us from looking higher. We want to aim at ourselves and build ourselves up, not necessarily aspire to follow the pattern that God has for us, honesty and integrity. We just want to be indefensible, or we want to be so protected and guarded by this high tower that we really don't need God. And I think you said it, Brett. I think it's them saying we don't need God.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point of the whole thing.
Make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I've also heard it said, I don't remember who said it, but something about there's an emphasis on the state too. That at this point there was a community and maybe even a city kind of state coming to be, and that there was a lot of emphasis put on the state itself as being the protector and almost taking the place of God.
Yeah.
That now that we have community, we have a good group of people here, and we're dividing up the jobs. We have civilization, the early civilization. We no longer need a higher power or a God. We can build something that'll be
A modern
better.
example of the Tower of Babel.
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 Yeah.
That's good. Would be, the Soviets, where the state was the end-all, be-all. It was the highest aim.
And it became, and Stalin himself was considered God. I mean, in that arena. So the head of the
sense,
state,
yeah.
the head of the state, yeah. But it is interesting. Of course, I like to take this a little bit farther and jump to the New Testament. And I find it a very significant point that as the languages were confused, but in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost,
Yes.
everyone came with speaking the unified Greek, or at least one common language. But when Peter began to speak, everyone heard him in their native tongue. So it's kind of like this gift of confusing languages, but now in the New Testament we see this gift of understanding like they'd never understood before.
Because it's unity by
The Spirit,
the Spirit,
Ruach.
by God,
That's
right? So God is the highest aim there, and it's like the reverse. This is the way it should be done.
But I think those stories need to be put together to get
Definitely.
to get it full meaning, and we'll try to do that on the weekend. so that fits very well.
That's one of the things that I've heard, even from Sherry. She was like, "Hey, we're doing Old Testament again. Like, when are we going to get back to the New Testament? Some of the Jesus stuff?" And my response was,
Jesus comes up every week.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, like the New Testament stories.
Okay.
But one of the things that I said was, it's really hard for me, it's been hard to take the New Testament by itself without understanding what was happening through these stories. These parts play such a big role in supporting the meaning of the New Testament stories, like the story of Pentecost.
Right.
The fact that the Tower of Babel was this, dispersing of all these different languages and doing all that, and then having that come back together. There's all of those. It's the Cain and Abel and the prodigal son. Like, you have these new kind of evolved, better versions of these stories, or maybe not better, but the completion of the story.
Yes, the completion.
That's a great way to say it. I agree with that.
I mean, in that case, though, that story is a better version because it realigns people's thinking.
But I think taking that story by itself, I think taking just the end of the story without the beginning of the story, loses all the basis for why the story has meaning to begin with.
Yeah.
And then you're stuck kind of creating this new thought around this thing because you didn't get the intro. It's like watching the end of a movie and saying, well, this is what the beginning looked like. It's like, go back and watch the beginning and you'll have a better understanding why the ending means anything.
I agree.
It makes it that much more profound.
And many times Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish but fulfill. So he came to complete. Let me tell you the completion of the story. You guys get caught up in this infancy stage, but you need to come around to the growth and the maturity stage and understand where it lands. And I think that's really a dynamic of the story. And the Tower of Babel. So my question would be, when do we find ourselves trying to build the tower? It'd be good questions to ask. When can I identify with those people? What am I doing in my life that all of a sudden I realize, hey, I'm part of the construction team trying to build the Tower of Babel?
I think it's happening right now in society when we're looking out into the political landscape and expecting that to solve our issues, or that to give us some sort of answers or some sort of solution.
This has been a cycle throughout history. I'm reading a book on Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad.
That sounds interesting.
Confucius is, he's in a time when the state has become morally depraved. And so there's a lot of chaos going on in society. And he's like a prophet wandering around trying to get all these political leaders to get in line and to readopt the virtuous ways of what he saw as the Zhou dynasty. It was like the perfect example of aiming at the highest.
Well, you see, obviously, in the story, in the New Testament and the Jesus stories as well, you see him making kind of semi-political stances and statements. I mean, there's a lot of people that would argue that Jesus was like a socialist, or there's like a hippie version of Jesus that they like to concoct. It's, he's just out there saying, hey, this is how we should live. We should all be in this one great community and all that. And I don't necessarily buy into that version of Jesus, so to speak. But
the difference is, though, that was all voluntary. It wasn't something that was mandated.
But you do see, him revolting against the oppressive forces of the day, the political forces of the day.
Right, and yes. I think his whole message was, I'm not for the system. I'm not for the Jewish system. I'm not for the imperial system of Rome either. He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. And he happened to have a whole band of zealots. This whole revolutionary out around the Sea of Galilee. Those guys were known to be very strong and very anti-Roman. So I don't think he...
Can you give a little bit of context as far as what was happening politically around that time with Rome and the Jewish people and how they were allowed to withhold their own laws? So they had their laws and then they had the Roman. Can you kind of just give an overview of that?
Yeah, I think the Roman imperial government reigned and ruled. They really owned the world, and they owned Israel. But what they do, they'd put just a person in charge there, like Herod, and he was responsible to take care of things. So he'd have the chief priest and all the synagogue. It's better to come in instead of changing everything. Let's leave this structure that they have. Let's just control the leaders of the structure. And that's what they did. But the high priest and all those guys were kind of, they were whining and dining with the Romans, and they really were, or at least they were enjoying the wealth of the Roman government. So when Jesus came in, he just saw these abuses. He saw the oppression, not only from the political system of Rome, but also from the imperial influence on the Jewish religious system. And he saw them married together. And it was very frustrating. So he spoke out against both at different times. But, he lived he was not without he was not without a lot of controversy, or they wouldn't have killed him.
Yeah.
And secondly, what he said through the parables, he was nailing them between the eyes with the parables. I mean, every parable has a zinger in it. It's kind of like an arrow shooting right between the eyes. Well, let me tell you a story, this story even about the people who come to work in the garden. They come in, they're paid so much per day, and the last guys come in, they get paid the same as the other guys. Hey, that's not right. That's not fair. That's the way the kingdom life is. So you guys have been serving your whole life. Guess what? It's not any more for you than it is for these. As a matter of fact, these guys are going to enter before you because you've lost sight of what it means to find the generosity in life, the grace of God. And I think he was very politically motivated. He did not come out, with a banner or anything like that. But he had
no friends. I mean, he was controversial even for the Zealots, because the Zealots were violent and he was passive. So it's like everywhere he turned, everyone was against him.
Yeah. But his disciples did have swords.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you had to. If you're traveling like they were, you have to defend yourself against bandits and all that, too.
Well, you've said before that they were part of a
Sicarii.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about that?
The Sicarii really were kind of terrorists in our words today, but they really were revolutionaries. And what happened is when the Roman legion would come by these northern Galilean towns, really around the Sea of Galilee, they would come out of the hills and they'd attack a little band and they'd wipe them out. Or they also were known as assassins. Mm-hmm. They'd be in a big gathering in the major cities, and they'd come up and they'd have these knives. The knives are kind of wavy. Those are called Sicarii, and they're part of this sect of revolutionary. And they would slip up behind somebody and they didn't like him. They'd knife him in the heart, and he'd drop, and then they'd drop the knife with him, and they'd step back like everybody else, like, oh, what happened? Well, these guys knew exactly where to put the blade. And it's interesting, Judas Iscariot, Sicarii, you can hear that in there. Mm-hmm. And you hear, Simon the Zealous, he was part of this band. So Jesus really pulled together a band of guys who would follow him and fight for him. But he was protected, but at the same time, he was quick to tell them, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Mm-hmm. It's okay to have it, but you just can't always use it. Keep it, but don't always pull it out.
Right.
They were the zealots that he had convinced, and at least by the end, that violence was just going to bring destruction.
Even in the garden?
No. I said the end.
Toward the end. Yeah.
So there we go, jump into the New Testament when we're supposed to be here in Genesis talking about the Tower of Babel. So getting back to it. But I think there is a big emphasis when we look at these stories as these unfolding of human consciousness and these monumental points in human development. I think that we do get to a point of civilization shortly thereafter, and I think that this is the story that really focuses on that. And so you've said it's about elevating the state almost to the point of being God, being the protector, being the thing that'll save you and take care of you when bad things happen. And ultimately what they find is that isn't true.
Well, what would be great is, we know now that actually civilization, by the time this story was, we don't know the oral tradition, I guess. We don't know how far back that goes. But by the time it was written, they had lots of experience with civilization. Sure. Because now we're going back 12,000 years. We've had human civilizations. So,
and it's thought even that this was written down, one of the last of the Torah, one of the last books of the first five. This was probably the last one penned, is what scholars think. So it came even later. Mm-hmm. Even though it's old, it was told a long time, because these stories, And the reason we have people in these stories and personalities, and so that the story has life. It's very static to say, 2 + 2 = 4, and, you can just use a lot of numbers. And
Human beings did this.
Yeah,
And
you got to give them a name, and you got to give them a personality.
Absolutely.
And I think that's
Well, this is how they told their history.
right.
I mean, they didn't have history books and facts and figures and data collection. They had oral tradition where
There was no scientific history.
right.
Yeah.
Eh,
But I think it sums up really to say, man makes a serious error when he thinks he can replace God.
Yeah.
Through whether it's a state or society and the evolution of human consciousness to the point of the polis or the city, and they understand the importance of speech, and it shows the importance of speech, so they confused it. But
it shows that the speech had such a creative.
That's right.
Was such a part of the creative force that created society. That one of the things that brought us together and allowed
order.
Yeah, allowed society to exist was the communication that we could have with each other.
yeah, I agree. And of course, you could segue to another New Testament story of the story of the man who built his house upon the rock versus the man who built his house upon the sand. And it's about this, stability of your foundation of what you do. And maybe they were building their tower on that which was not on the principles that they should align themselves with. Human principles rather than righteous, godlike principles. So I think that could be a nice segue too. But even though their spirit was at that point separated and they began to do their own thing, I just love again back to Acts 2 where it just comes back and grounds again.
Yeah.
So where that same spirit is a unifying spirit if we're focused in the right direction.
Are we going to go into Abraham in this series?
I think the last talk that we'll do will be on Abraham. Just to set up, because we're talking about the beginnings of lots of things, and I think it's appropriate. Hello, world. Here's the beginning of the first guy that we have in history that really was significant for the Judeo-Christian faith.
And others. I mean, it's really, he's so central.
Right.
So we'll go through Tower of Babel this week. Next week we'll
talk about Abraham,
and then we'll conclude the series. Any idea what you want to go into next?
Palm Sunday and Easter.
Right. Gives us a little buffer time to get ready for the next one.
Yeah, it gives us a little, and we got a couple ideas working, but we'll talk about that.
I'm excited. Well, this has been good. I hope.
I think it was.
If you're listening, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a good one.